Hello, welcome to Lesson 23, Angle Rules. During this lesson, we are going to learn what happens when two parallel lines are cut by a transversal. Before we begin, let's look at a few key vocabulary words. Parallel lines, lines that never touch or intersect. Transversal, the line that intersects two or more parallel lines. Complementary angles, two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Supplementary angles, two angles that add up to 180 degrees. Congruent angles, same size and same shape. So, I'm going to stop there for a minute and I'm going to draw some pictures that represent the terms that we just spoke of. So if we have two parallel lines, like so, they never touch. They go on in both directions. And parallel lines remind me of railroad tracks. Railroad tracks never touch. Or the lines on a 4-lane, they never touch. So we're going to call this line A and this one line B. So these guys are going to be intersected by line C. And line C is known as a transversal. So I'm going to say line A is parallel to line B. So the symbol for parallel is the two lines that never touch. And it actually looks like the number 11. So line A is parallel to line B. And when these guys intersect, when this transversal intersects our parallel lines, 8 angles are formed. Okay? So we have 8 angles being formed. And we're going to discuss what type of angles are made when this happens. But before we begin, let's talk about complementary angles. They add up to 90 degrees. So complementary angles looks like an L, but there's a little line in between. And what that says is angle 1 and angle 2 would add up to 90 degrees because it looks like an L, okay? That 90-degree angle, okay? So perhaps this one would be 30 degrees. Well, then angle 1 would have to be 60, okay? So those two angles, their sum would add up to 90 degrees. Okay, well, complementary is a little different from supplementary, okay, actually a lot. Supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. They form a straight line, and sometimes they'll call this a straight angle, but all that means is that these two angles, when you add them up, they would equal 180 degrees. I can tell this is my acute angle, smaller than 90, so I'm going to say this is about 50 degrees. So angle 1 would have to be 130 degrees. Why? Because their sum has to add up to 180 degrees. So complementary angles, supplementary angles. Okay, so what the bulk of our lesson today is about all of our angle rules. So I'm going to break it down rule by rule, and the first one we're going to talk about are vertical angles. Okay, vertical angles are directly across from one another. Let me get a new color. So vertical angles are directly across from one another, and they look like the letter V. Okay, so 1 and 4, for example, would be vertical angles. They're directly across from one another. They're congruent, the same size and same shape. So 1 and 4 would be vertical angles. 2 and 3 would be vertical angles. Okay, 5 and 8 are vertical angles, and then 6 and 7 are vertical angles. Okay, so I'm going to double up on those collars to sort of separate. So at the top, my green lines, my green circles are vertical, and then my green and red are also vertical. See how I separated that? But in this PowerPoint slide at the end of the lesson, I've separated them, and so you may want to reflect back on each individual picture. So these are called vertical angles. All right? And they're directly across from one another, and they look like the letter V. So sometimes I'll tell my students to sort of draw on the parallel lines cut by a transversal, and when you can make the letter V, those are your vertical angles. And they're congruent. So what that means is if this angle was, let's say, 40 degrees, well, angle 3 would also have to be 40 degrees. They are congruent angles. Well, what do we know about side-by-side angles? They form a straight line. So if this is 40 degrees, then this must be 140 degrees. Okay? Well, then 4 is across from 1, so it must be 140 degrees. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to go on to our next angle rule before I get too carried away. Okay? So let's look at another type of angle rule. So we have two parallel lines cut by a transversal. Okay? I've got 8 angles. Okay? Let's talk about corresponding angles. All right? Corresponding angles. And what that means is they're in the same relative location. So corresponding angles are either both on top of the line or both beneath the line. So 1 is on top of the parallel line and on the same side of the transversal, and so is 5. So 1 and 5 would be my corresponding angles. Also, 3 and 7 would be a set of corresponding angles. They're both beneath the parallel lines on the same side of the transversal. Okay? Let's look at the other side. 2 is on top of the line, and so is 6. So 2 and 6 are both corresponding angles. And let's do one more. I need a different color marker. 4 and 8. Okay? They would be corresponding angles because they're both beneath the parallel lines on the right-hand side of the transversal. Again, corresponding angles are in the same relative location, either both on top of the parallel lines or both beneath the parallel lines. So that's corresponding angles. And again, they are congruent, which means they are the same size and same shape. So if this angle was, let's say, 120 degrees, angle 1, I can tell it's obtuse, it's larger than 90, then 5 would also have to be 120 degrees. Again, they're beside of each other, so they would have to add up to 180. So I know that angle 3 would be 60 degrees, which means 7 would be 60 degrees. Again, because they're corresponding. And I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to stop there and I'm going to go on to the next angle rule. Okay, so that was corresponding. Let's look at, how about alternate exterior? Okay, so let's get my 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal. Okay, alternate exterior angles. And when I say the word exterior, it reminds me of being outside. So they have to be on the outside of these parallel lines. So alternate exterior would be 1 and 8. Again, they're on the outside of the parallel lines and on the opposite sides of the transversal, alternate exterior. So 1 and 8 are alternate exterior angles, and also 7 and 2. Okay, 7 and 2. So those are my alternate exterior angles. They're on the outside of the parallel lines and on the opposite sides of the transversal. They are also congruent angles. So if angle 2 was let's say 70 degrees, okay, then angle 7 would also be 70 degrees. What does that leave angles 8 and 1 being? 110, because their sum needs to add up to 180 degrees. They're beside of one another. That's called adjacent angles, straight angles. Their sum is 180. Again, if angle 8 is 110, then angle 1 is 110 degrees. So that is alternate exterior angles, okay? Alternate exterior angles. All right, let's move on to alternate interior angles, okay? So alternate interior, and I'm just going to abbreviate a little bit. So 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal. Again, that is going to give us 8 angles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So interior, think about your interior doors. Those are on the inside. Interior would be on the inside of the parallel lines, so like 3 and 6, but on the opposite side of the transversal. So angles 3 and 6 our alternate interior angles. Angles 4 and 5 are alternate interior angles, and they are also congruent. So if 3, let's see, I can tell 3 and 6 are going to be my acute angles because they're smaller than an L. They're acute. Let's say they look like they're about 60 degrees. Okay, so they would both be 60 degrees. They were my acute angles. They're congruent, 3 and 6. That leaves 4 and 5 being 120 degrees. Okay, again, they have to add up to 180. So far, we've talked about vertical angles. We've talked about corresponding. I'm abbreviating a little bit. We've talked about alternate exterior. We've talked about alternate interior. I've mentioned adjacent, which means they're beside of one another. So these are our main angle rules. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you that if you're given at least one angle measure, you can determine the other 7. Okay? So let's practice one last time. All right, so I'm going to give you, here's our angles. So if I give you only one angle measure, you can use all of your angle rules to find the other 7. Let's see how that works. So if I tell you that 2 is 40 degrees, okay, and I want to know what the measures of all the other angles are. Well, I know that 2 and 3 are vertical angles, so 3 must be 40 degrees. Well, I know that 3 and 7 are corresponding angles. They're both underneath the parallel lines. So 7 is 40. Then I look across from 7 and there's 6. They're vertical angles. So 6 is 40 degrees. Okay, so what else could I do to find the other remaining angles? Well, angles that are beside of one another have to add up to 180. So 180 minus 40 is 140. Okay. Does 5 look like an obtuse angle? It certainly does. It's wider than an L. So now across from 5 is angle 8, and it would be 140. Well, alternate exterior angles are congruent, so angle 1 would be 140 degrees. Well, 4 is across from angle 1. They're vertical angles. And so now look at what's happened. We have all 8 angle measures when only being given 1. So that wraps up our lesson on angle rules. Feel free to look at the slides at the end of this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.